My name is Maeve Sterling. I'm 33, and the day my mother emptied my bank account, I sat in my car and laughed until my chest ached. Not because I was happy. My mother had just demanded 24 Zalogen for my sister's over, the top botanical garden wedding. I had finally looked her in the eye and said no. 2 days later, every single dollar I'd spent 6 years sweating for was gone. She had used the emergency card I trusted her with when I was drifting in a hospital bed with severe pneumonia. I laughed because the scales finally fell from my eyes. I saw the generational machine my family had been running on me my entire life. What I did next blew up my relationship with everyone I shared blood with. But the very next morning, my sister called me in a screaming panic. And that is where the real reckoning began. Welcome back to Their Secret Stories, where we sit with the quiet decisions that redefine a family forever and the women who finally decide they've paid enough rent on someone else's life. If a story here ever makes you feel a little less alone, that's why we exist. So, before we go further, drop a comment with your city and time. And be sure to subscribe, because what unfolded over the next 6 weeks taught me something I wish I had known at 18. Love that operates like a ledger was never love at all. And the one they all branded as selfish was the only one speaking the absolute truth. I guide commercial planes through pitch black skies for a living. Air traffic control night shift 10 years now. It is a world where a single miscalculation can cause an unimaginable disaster in under 90 seconds, and when the alarms flash, everyone in the tower holds their breath and looks at you. I am an expert at staying icy calm. I've had a lifetime of practice, because I've been the designated shock absorber in my family since I was a child. When my parents screamed about debt, I swept the floor. When my younger sister forgot her high school midterms, I stayed up all night typing her papers. When the septic tank collapsed, I quietly transferred the funds to fix it. Somewhere along the way, being the responsible one became my entire identity, and that identity became a debt that nobody else ever helped me clear. That spring, for the exact first time, I allowed myself to want something that belonged entirely to me. On my freezer, held up by a fossilized shark tooth magnet, was a bank pre-approval letter and a closing date. It was for a 3-acre plot of rugged coastal land on Blackwood Cove, featuring a tiny cedar cabin and a view of the gray northern ocean. I had saved $24,000 for the down payment, 6 years of brown bagging my meals, skipping holidays, and taking every brutal, high-stress double shift the control tower would hand me. I used to drive out to that cove on my dawn commutes, watching the tide roll in, imagining a life where my only worry was the weather. I wanted a space where the only ledger kept was the rising of the sun. What I didn't know then was how high the entry fee would be and how much blood I would have to spill to finally claim my own ground. Sunday dinners at my mother's house were conducted with the strict hierarchy of a court, and I was the servant everyone ignored. My mother, Diana, poured iced tea for my sister, Chloe, first always. Even if the pitcher was sitting right next to my hand, she asked Chloe about her aesthetic, her job as a boutique consultant, her delicate anxiety. She asked me if I had cleaned the mud off the back porch yet. Chloe is 25, 8 years younger, and she was born expecting to be carried. I was born holding the stretcher. Nobody ever sat us down to explain this law. You simply learn your place by the silence that greets your efforts. My father, George, sat at the end of the table and nodded along with whoever spoke last. He is a passive man, and I used to mistake his passivity for gentleness. The only person who ever truly saw the game we were playing was my grandfather, Arthur, my mother's father, a retired cargo pilot who flew until his heart forced him down. He would watch me scrubbing the pots after dinner and just sigh. Once, out by his old tool shed, he gripped my shoulder and said words that became an anchor in my mind. Love that keeps a logbook isn't love, Maeve. It's just salvage rights. And they're trying to salvage your entire life. He passed away 3 years ago at 89, and it felt like the only person who actually knew my real name had walked out of the house. That particular Sunday, my mother set down the roast and announced casually, as if talking about the morning news, that Chloe's wedding at the solarium glasshouse was going to be an elite affair. Imported orchids, a live jazz's ensemble, 200 guests under heated glass domes. She looked directly at me as she spoke, not at Chloe, and a cold, heavy silence filled my chest, the exact silence that hits the control tower right before a radar blip disappears. I told myself I was being paranoid. I have a long history of making excuses for them. It's a habit that has cost me far more than any bank transfer ever could. She cornered me by the washing machine. That was where the dirty laundry of the family was always washed, literally and figuratively, where the noise of the spin cycle drowned out the negotiations. My mother folded a sheet that didn't need folding and gave me the number like she was reading a dry cleaning bill. 24 Zavalausen. That's what the glasshouse booking requires, and that's what you're putting down. She didn't ask. Asking is for people who recognize that no is an option. She said it the way she used to tell me I was staying home to clean the garage while the rest of them went to the lake. Efficiently. Unbendingly. My mother was never loud. Loudness gives you something to fight against. What she had was absolute entitlement, and entitlement is heavier than any screamed threat. I stood there with a damp towel in my hand, my mind instantly calculating the sum. But 24,000 was not an abstract number. It was the exact figure taped to my freezer under the shark tooth magnet. It was Blackwood Cove. It was the cedar cabin, the cold ocean air, and 6 years of my life. She knew that. She had to, because I had poured my heart out to her about the land at this very washing machine 3 weeks prior, and she had merely muttered, "How nice," before pivoting to Chloe's bridal registry. Now, she wanted the deed to my sanity to pay for a glass greenhouse and a jazz band. "You've always been the strong one, Maeve," she said, tapping my cheek like I was a reliable engine. "Chloe crumbles under pressure, you don't." And there it was. The entire creed of our family in a single breath. Delivered over laundry detergent. "You can bear it, Chloe can't." As if my strength was a natural resource she had the right to mine, rather than an armor had been forced to forge. No, I said it was quiet, but it was rock solid. 33 years of automatic compliance. And the refusal simply stepped out of my mouth like it had been waiting for the door to open. My mother froze, her fingers tightening on the fabric. First came the wounded maternal expression, the emotional blackmail that had crushed 1,000 boundaries before they could take root. When I didn't flinch, her warmth evaporated. She reminded me of her labor pain. She listed every dollar spent on my childhood, itemizing my existence like a debt collector presenting a past due notice. Real families, she sneered, don't count pennies when someone they love is starting a life. Which was spectacular. Coming from a woman who had just handed me a 24,000 invoice over a washing machine. Chloe stepped into the utility room, her arms crossed, tears already pooling in her eyes. "This is my dream day," she cried, as if my bank account was a weapon I was using to destroy her future. My father stared at his boots like they held the secrets of the universe. Nobody screamed. In my family, the weapons are forged of pure obligation. They don't leave physical scars you can show a doctor. I stood my ground, though it felt like standing on a fault line during a massive tremor, waiting to see which part of my life would collapse first. My mother looked at me and a chilling thing happened. She smiled, a tiny secret smile. The look of a woman who just remembered where she hid the bolt cutters. "We'll manage," she said softly, patting my arm again before walking out to clear the table. I should have known right then. When my mother stops fighting, It isn't because she has accepted your boundary. It's because she's decided she doesn't need your permission to cross it. Here is the sequence of events I've dissected a million times, searching for my own stupidity and never finding it. 6 months before that Sunday, a severe lung infection turned into sepsis. I drove myself to my own hospital, barely conscious, and woke up 8 hours later with an oxygen mask, a chest tube, and a stack of medical intake forms I couldn't even read. I live alone in a small apartment near the airport, 20 minutes from my parents. I had no one else to turn to, so I handed my mother my wallet. Get my mail. Pay the utility bills so the water stays on. Just keep things running until I can breathe on my own. I gave her my debit card and my online password, the way you hand your lifelines to the person who is supposed to guard them with her life. When I was discharged and my head cleared, I did the smart thing. I changed my online banking password. I told myself I was being secure, not suspicious. Because they only call you suspicious right before they prove you were right all along. What I didn't do, what never even crossed my mind, was cancel the physical card she had held or the account numbers she had copied down in her neat, precise handwriting. Why would I? She was my mother. In 10 years of watching radar screens, I've learned that the collision almost never comes from a rogue plane entering your airspace. It comes from the aircraft you've already cleared, the one you trusted to follow the coordinates, descending directly into your path. I locked my doors. I set my security alarms. And the entire time, the code to drain my life was sitting in a notebook in my mother's kitchen drawer, waiting for the day she decided her younger daughter's vanity was worth more than my survival. The harassment began on Monday morning. My Aunt Martha called first, my mother's sister and loyal enabler, her voice dripping with disappointment. It's just a wedding. Maeve, why must you be so incredibly cold? Then a cousin. Then my mother's childhood friend, a woman I hadn't seen since middle school, calling to lecture me that blood is thicker than water, from a woman who once sued her own brother over a lawnmower. They came in relentless shifts, like planes stacked in a holding pattern, designed to wear down my resolve. The script was identical. Chloe deserves this memory. You have the savings. Don't make your mother beg. Nobody asked why the financial burden of my sister's wedding belonged to me. That question didn't exist in our household. The river flows one way, and I was the riverbed. I held out, but the pressure was immense, eroding my peace one guilt-ridden call at a time. That is the trap of being the family fixer. They don't have to prove you owe them anything. They just have to repeat the lie until your own mind starts to wonder if you're the monster they say you are. Between the calls, I would open my banking app just to stare at my down payment. It was a compulsion, like checking a physical wound to make sure it was still closed. Closing day on the Blackwood Cove property was 15 days away. The balance was still there. All 24,000 of it quiet and untouched. I remember feeling a foolish surge of relief. You did it, I whispered to myself. You protected your future. There was an automated notification from my bank at the top of my screen that I swiped away because I was rushing to start my night shift and believed the worst of the storm had passed. I finally opened that notification after a grueling 12-hour shift, standing in the cold morning air of the airport parking lot. It was a high-value transfer alert, asking for my confirmation. My fingers moved automatically. I logged into the app, preparing to execute the wire to the escrow officer, a moment I had dreamed of for half a decade. My balance was $14.20. I stared at the screen, my brain refusing to process the digits, waiting for the system to refresh for a network error for anything. Then I saw the transaction history, the 24,000 transferred 3 days prior to a merchant called Solarium Glasshouse Events. Deposit for the Sterling Vance wedding. My knees hit the damp asphalt of the parking lot. I have coordinated emergency landings for planes with burning engines, and I finally understood the absolute, dead silence that fills a cockpit when the power dies. It isn't a scream. It is the sound of an entire lifetime being erased in a fraction of a second. I tapped the transfer details with a hand that felt completely detached from my body. The authorizing signature on the electronic wire profile read Deanna Sterling. My mother hadn't backed down. She had simply bypassed the lock and taken what she wanted. I want to pause here. If you have ever been the one who carries the weight, the one who handles the crisis while everyone else panics, you know the exact cracking sound my chest made against that cold asphalt. Stay with us, because what I did next is something my family still speaks of in whispers. If this story is hitting a nerve, comment the words, "I've been hurt," so I know you're out there, and subscribe to their secret stories, because we are only just scratching the surface. I didn't shed a single tear in that parking lot. I laughed. It started as a sharp, dry rattle in my throat, and then it took over my entire body, bending me double against the hood of my car until my ribs burned and an airport security guard walked over to ask if I needed medical assistance. I didn't need a doctor. For the first time in 33 years, I was completely sobered. In that hysterical, freezing laughter, the entire landscape of my life became blindingly clear. Every invoice I had quietly paid, every boundary I had allowed them to trample, every Sunday I spent serving a family that viewed me as an unpaid utility. It was never bad luck. It was never a series of unfortunate events. It was a highly efficient, generational machine, and I had been both its engine and its engineer, tightening my own collar and calling it family loyalty. My grandfather's voice echoed through the cold morning air, "Love that keeps a logbook isn't love." And I realized, standing there in my uniform with $14 to my name, that I had been paying rent to exist in my own family. And I had just been evicted for daring to ask for a receipt. The laughter died, replaced by a cold, surgical focus. Not anger. Anger is loud, erratic, and burns itself out. This was the deep, quiet focus I feel when two planes are on a collision course, and I have exactly 3 seconds to separate them. I wiped my eyes, got into my car, and drove. Not to my apartment to hide. I put the car in gear and drove straight to the central branch of my bank. I called my mother from the driver's seat before I walked through the glass doors. I wanted to hear the truth from her mouth before the lawyers took over. She answered quickly, her voice bright and humming with energy. I asked her point blank if she had taken the 24,000 from my savings. She didn't even hesitate. She didn't deny it. She just let out a soft, maternal sigh, the sound of a mother dealing with a dramatic child. I did what had to be done. "Maeve," she said smoothly, "you were being incredibly selfish. The deadline was yesterday, and you have plenty of time to save more." I simply corrected the situation. Like my hard-earned life was a typo she had the right to erase. "I brought you into this world, Maeve," she continued, her voice rising with practiced authority. "I gave up my youth for you. $24,000 is a drop in the bucket compared to what you owe this family. You'll get over it. You always do." That was the line that sealed her fate. You always do. She wasn't even defensive. That was the most terrifying part. She genuinely believed she had merely allocated family funds to where they were most useful. The way you take a toy from the older child because the younger one is crying for it. And then she said the words that will ring in my ears until the day I die. "Chloe needs this more than you do. Not deserved. Needed." As if my mother had been quietly assessing her daughter's value on a scale for decades and had finally announced the score. One of us was a human being. The other was an ATM. I said nothing for a long, heavy beat. She mistook my silence for the usual surrender, the familiar sound of me bending under the weight, and her tone softened into something patronizing. "That's my good girl," she whispered. "I knew you'd see reason." I hung up, walked into the bank, and asked to speak directly to the manager of the fraud division. The investigator was a sharp, methodical man named Agent Silas. He pulled up my transactions, and I watched his posture stiffen as he scanned the screen. He asked the standard protocol questions. Did I authorize this transaction? No. Did I know the individual who initiated the transfer? Yes. Then he asked the question that drew a line in the sand between my past and my future. M's. "Sterling," he said, looking at me over his glasses, "do you wish to file a formal criminal complaint? Because given the amount, this is a grand larceny charge. It goes straight to the district attorney. It becomes a police matter." I felt the entire weight of my family's history crash down on that small mahogany desk. A police matter. Handcuffs. Mugshots. My mother's name entered into a state database that doesn't care about family loyalty. I thought of my grandfather's trust. Though I didn't know the exact wording yet, only that the law and my family were about to collide in an irreversible explosion. Silas slid the authorization form toward me and laid a heavy metal pen on top of it. Then, out of professional courtesy, he gave me a bridge back to the shore. "You can choose to dispute this internally," he murmured. "We can attempt to claw back the funds as an unauthorized family transaction. No police report. Many families choose that route when it's complicated." He said complicated like a lifeline, and I knew he was offering me the exact same exit my family had always expected me to take. Keep it quiet. Keep it buried. Take the loss and let the machine keep grinding. I looked at that pen. I thought of the wind blowing across Blackwood Cove, the sound of my grandfather's voice, and the smug, victorious smile my mother makes when she thinks she has successfully broken me. I did not pick up the pen. Not yet. I had one more stop to make. My father was sitting on the steps of my apartment building when I got home, which told me everything. My mother was terrified, and she had sent her peacekeeper. George doesn't leave his armchair for anything less than a house fire. He stood up as I approached, holding his jacket, and I felt the familiar, conditioned urge to make it easy for him, to absorb his discomfort so he wouldn't have to feel the tension. I forced my hands into my pockets and stood still. "Maeve," he said, his voice cracking. "Please don't do this. Whatever you're planning, she's your mother. We don't drag our own blood into the mud." I asked him what our own blood was supposed to do when a mother robs her daughter to pay for a party. He looked down at his shoes. "That is where George Sterling has kept his spine for 40 years. She shouldn't have done it," he muttered, so softly I could barely hear him over the traffic. "But it was for Chloe. She wasn't buying jewelry, Maeve. You know how she is when Chloe cries. And there was the absolute tragedy of my father. He knew it was a crime. He just didn't care enough to disrupt his own comfort to stop it." Then he let slip the piece of information that changed the entire coordinates of the flight. "She did it to Arthur, too." Near the end, he whispered, referring to my grandfather's pension. We kept it quiet. It worked itself out. He realized what he'd said a second too late and closed his mouth. But the words were already hanging in the air like poison gas. She did it to Arthur, too. I stood on my own steps and felt the ground beneath my feet turn to dust. This wasn't a sudden lapse in judgment. This was a pattern of behavior. My mother was a serial parasite, and the family had been covering her tracks for decades. I drove to Chloe's luxury apartment that night because I needed to know if my sister was an innocent passenger in this theft or an active co-pilot. I got my answer the second she opened the door. She was wearing a silk robe, holding a champagne flute and a wedding planning binder, with not a single shred of shame on her face. To feel shame, you have to possess a conscience. I told her the money currently sitting in the glasshouse registry was my stolen future. She didn't even blink. She took a sip of her champagne. "You always figure things out, Maeve," she said, as if she were complimenting my resourcefulness. "You have a great career. You don't even have a partner. What do you need 3 acres of empty land for anyway?" I asked her if she knew our mother had stolen it without my consent. Of course I knew. She had watched the wire clear and asked 0 questions. She had simply accepted the prize. "It's my wedding," she said, using that word like a shield against any moral obligation. "Mom said you'd get over it. She said you always fall in line." There it was again. You always fall in line. My mother had built her entire crime on the absolute certainty of my compliance. Maeve bends. Maeve always bends. Then Chloe, smiling, delivered the final nail in her own coffin. "The glasshouse contract is completely ironclad," she gloated. "The deposit is locked in. No refunds, no cancellations. It's already spent." She smiled that identical, small, victorious smile, and I realized I was looking at the next generation of the machine. The exact same programming, passed down from mother to daughter, ready to consume anyone in its path. I left without saying another word. There is no point in arguing with a thief who believes she has a right to your life. There was only one thing left to do. 2 days later, I sat across from Detective Miller in a quiet interrogation room. He was a seasoned, cynical cop who looked like he'd seen every dirty trick a family could play on itself. He had my financial records highlighted in yellow on the table. "It's an open and shut case," he said flatly. Then he placed a formal criminal complaint on the desk, set a pen beside it, and watched me. "Name the suspect," he said. My hand hovered over the paper. 33 years of silence screamed at me to stop. Every holiday dinner, every buried secret, every loyalty test. My entire upbringing had been a training course in one discipline, protecting the family from the consequences of their actions. And now, a detective was asking me to put the truth on a public record where it could never be erased. I thought of my grandfather Arthur, who had faced this exact crossroads with his own daughter, chosen to protect her, and by doing so, had guaranteed that the bill would eventually be passed down to me. I picked up the pen. My hand was steady. I wrote Diana Sterling. The moment I set the pen down, my phone began to vibrate violently on the table. It was Chloe. I stepped out into the corridor to answer, and her voice was already shrill with panic. "What did you do?" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "When I filed the fraud dispute, the bank had done exactly what federal regulations require. They froze the disputed transaction, flagged the funds, and notified the solarium glasshouse that the 24 Zalosen was the subject of an act of grand larceny investigation. The venue, terrified of being tied to a criminal prosecution, had immediately canceled the booking and returned the funds to the escrow hold. Contract Chloe had bragged about was gone. Her dream venue was gone. The machine had ground to a screeching halt because, for the first time in her life, the fuel had been cut off and she was left standing in the dark. "You have to fix this!" she screamed. Even in her panic, the program was running. Maeve will fix it. Maeve always fixes it. When she realized I wasn't moving, her desperation turned into venom. "If you don't drop the charges," she hissed, "I'll tell Julian what you're doing to our family." She thought Julian, her wealthy architect fiancé, would be her weapon against me. She had no idea she had just handed me the match that would burn her entire world down. I hung up the phone and walked back into the room to sign the final affidavit. The family tribunal was called at my mother's house that weekend, and I was summoned like a prisoner to a sentencing. I went because I wanted to look them in the eyes when they realized I was no longer playing their game. They were all gathered. My mother, cold and defiant at the head of the table, Aunt Martha, my father staring at his hands, Chloe, red-eyed and trembling. The moment I entered, the air in the room grew heavy. Aunt Martha stood up, delivering the family defense with practiced drama. "Family," she declared, does not involve the police. They all nodded in unison. Not one of them had the honesty to finish the sentence. Family does not involve the police. But family is fully allowed to rob you to the bone. In their eyes, the theft wasn't the violation. My refusal to accept it was. I looked around that table at the people I had supported, protected, and loved, and I saw a room full of strangers. My mother had bet everything on the belief that the family would protect the predator and exile the prey. And she had been right. As I walked out of the house for the last time, Great Aunt Clara 80 followed me onto the driveway. She pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand and whispered, "Go see Arthur's attorney, Evelyn Cross." Evelyn Cross had an office in the historic district, and a framed photo of my grandfather hung behind her desk. She looked at me with deep, knowing eyes. "Maeve," she said, "he always hoped you'd come see me. Sit down." She opened a secure file and pulled out my grandfather's true estate planning documents. Arthur had left a prime piece of coastal property and a significant investment trust to be divided among his descendants. But there was a specific, hidden clause. Evelyn read it aloud. "Any beneficiary who is convicted of a felony involving theft, fraud, or financial dishonesty shall immediately and irrevocably forfeit their entire share of the estate, which shall be redistributed equally among the remaining honest heirs." I stared at the document. If my mother was convicted of stealing my down payment, she would lose her entire inheritance from her father. I had gone to the police to recover my savings, and I had walked out with the power to strip my mother of everything she had spent her life waiting to inherit. I asked Evelyn why my grandfather would insert such a brutal clause. She looked at the photo of Arthur, then back at me. "He wrote that clause," she said softly, "the year your mother cleaned out his personal accounts while he was in the hospital. I wasn't the first victim. I was just the next one in line. And my grandfather, unable to prosecute his own daughter in life, had built a legal trap from beyond the grave, waiting for the day she tried to run the same machine on me." For a brief second, I felt a deep pity for my mother. She had been Arthur's fixer once. She had been the responsible daughter who stayed behind while Martha lived her life. And because she was never thanked, she had decided she had the right to take her payment by force. But understanding the origin of a monster doesn't mean you let it devour you. 2 days later, I sat in the district attorney's office and signed the formal, sworn prosecution agreement. Detective Miller gave me one final look. "Once this is filed, Maeve, the state owns it. There is no turning back, you sure?" I thought of 33 years of being the family's sacrifice. I signed my name, Maeve Sterling. My phone lit up with 22 missed calls the second I stepped out of the building. The entire family network was screaming as the gears of the machine stripped themselves of their teeth. I drove out to Blackwood Cove, parked my car near the water, and sat in the quiet until the shaking stopped. The fallout was immediate and public. My mother was arrested and charged with grand larceny and identity theft. In a small town, that news travels faster than light. But the community didn't tell the story of a mother who stole. They told the story of a cold, heartless daughter who put her own mother in handcuffs over a wedding disagreement. My mother played the victim beautifully, weeping on social media and to anyone at the local market who would listen. At work, a colleague asked me if a piece of land was really worth destroying my family over. I looked her in the eye and said, "She stole my life savings while I was on oxygen." I watched the colleague's face drain of color. They hadn't been told that part of the story. Julian, Chloe's fiancé, called me 3 days later. He was an honest, hard-working man who had been kept entirely in the dark. "The money for the solarium," he said quietly. "Chloe told me it was an inheritance gift from your grandfather. Is that true?" I didn't lie for them anymore. I told him every single detail, from the hospital card theft to the pending criminal charges. There was a long, cold silence on the other end of the line. He thanked me and hung up. He went home, confronted Chloe, and watched her use our mother's exact excuses, her mother's exact tone of entitlement. Julian saw the future waiting for him. He saw the machine he was about to sign his name to. 3 days later, he moved his things out of their apartment, canceled the engagement, and walked away. Chloe's perfect, curated life fell apart in the span of 72 hours. Before the formal trial, the assistant DA called me in. The defense was offering a settlement my mother would return every cent of the 24,000 immediately from her personal funds if I signed a petition for leniency, allowing her to plead to a misdemeanor with no jail time and no felony record. They left me alone in a conference room with the settlement papers and a black pen. I almost signed it. I wanted the nightmare to end. I wanted my family to look at me without hatred. I wanted to go back to the warm, comfortable lie of being the good daughter. But then the weight of my grandfather's words pressed into my chest. Love that keeps a logbook isn't love. It's just rent. If I signed that paper, I was merely paying another installment of rent to live in a house where I had no value. The reconciliation was a lie. It was just a lease renewal on my own subjugation. I walked back into the room, looked the DA in the eye, and said, "We'll go to trial." Chloe came to my apartment the night before the hearing. She looked hollow, stripped of her champagne and her confidence. "You destroyed everything," she whispered, her voice cracking into tears. I didn't comfort her. I kept my hands by my side. "Mom said you'd always pay." Chloe sobbed, looking up at me. She always told me, "Don't worry about the cost. Maeve will pay." It was the most honest thing she had ever said. She finally saw the script we had both been assigned. I was the producer, she was the consumer, and neither of us had ever been loved for who we actually were. "You don't have to pay her rent either, Chloe," I said gently. Neither of us was ever the debt. At the preliminary hearing, my mother sat at the defense table in a modest navy outfit, looking frail and defeated. My father sat behind her, his eyes fixed on the floor. Aunt Martha glared at me like I was a murderer. The judge looked down at me from the bench. "Does the complaining witness wish to proceed with the state's charges?" My mother turned in her chair, her eyes locking onto mine, her mouth forming the silent word. "Please, Your Honor," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the courtroom. "I wish to proceed." And with those words, the machine broke forever. My mother didn't go to prison, but she took a felony plea that will follow her for the rest of her life. The moment the felony conviction was recorded, the forfeiture clause in Arthur's trust triggered automatically. Her share of the estate, the coastal property and the investments, was legally stripped from her hands and divided between Chloe and myself. My father put his arm around my mother and walked her out of the courthouse, choosing to remain in the ruins of the temple rather than stand in the light with his daughter. He had made his choice 40 years ago, and he was too old to change seats now. But as I stood in the corridor, Chloe was waiting for me by the exit. She was quiet, her makeup ruined, looking like a person who had just woken up from a lifetime of hypnosis. The court ordered restitution returned my 24,000 within a month. I closed on the Blackwood Cove property on a rainy Tuesday. I stood on the bluff, watching the gray waves crash against the rocks, the keys to the cedar cabin heavy in my hand. I didn't feel a rush of triumph. I felt the profound, aching quiet of a woman who had to burn down her own childhood home to build a shelter of her own. But it was mine. Every grain of soil, every cedar shingle, bought with my own blood and one single, beautiful word, no. My mother has cut off all contact, and her silence is the greatest gift she has ever given me. But in the months that followed, other members of the family began to reach out privately in whispered phone calls and late-night texts. An uncle, a cousin, a niece. They had all been feeding the same machine in their own corners of the family, and watching me pull the plug had given them the courage to look for the outlet. Chloe visited the cabin last week. She didn't complain about the cold or the remote location. She sat on my porch, looked out at the ocean, and asked me a real question. How did you survive being the one who had to carry it all? By realizing I was allowed to put it down, I told her. We sat together at my wooden table and drank tea I poured for both of us at the exact same time. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation. We aren't those kinds of sisters. But it was a start, a clean slate with no ledger, no debts, and no rent due. My grandfather was right. Love that keeps a logbook isn't love. And the day I stopped paying, I finally found my way home. This has been their secret stories. If you've ever been asked to pay for a love that should have been free, let this be your sign to put down the pen. You were never the debt. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Leave your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you in the next story.